Hello, my name is Anna Duensing. I'm a PhD candidate at Yale University working on a dissertation about anti-fascism within the civil rights movement and Black radical theories of fascism in the United States from the 1930s onward. And today, as part of the Fortunoff Video Archives commemoration of Black History Month, I'd like to talk to you about one aspect of that research, which concerns African American military service during World War II. And more generally, how soldiers and veterans have contributed to the Black freedom struggle across the 20th century. And within that work, I want to elevate the experiences of African American GIs who confronted Nazi Germany firsthand, and those who really at the heart of that experience were eyewitness to the end stages and immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. And for the most part, these men are known as liberators today. That refers to soldiers who pushed into the crumbling Third Reich in the spring and summer of 1945 and who encountered the Buchenwald, Dora Mittelbau, Flossenburg, Dachau, and Mauthausen concentration camps. And the Fortunoff is home to the remarkable testimony of one such soldier. His name was Leon Bass. Bass was also a lifelong educator who spent the last 4.5 decades of his life. Up until his death in 2015, he spent those years speaking out about his military experience and what it meant for him to witness Buchenwald while serving in a segregated army. Really how subsequent decades of reckoning with the Holocaust contributed to his interest in education, his involvement in the civil rights movement, and more generally, how the experience of witnessing this aspect, this culmination of Nazi persecution, shaped his understanding subsequently of U.S. race relations and more generally the realities of ongoing racial violence and white supremacy in the United States. Now, Leon Bass was born and raised in Philadelphia. He grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood. He went to all Black schools, and he describes that his parents, who were former sharecroppers from South Carolina, they had kept him relatively sheltered from the full force and structural violence of racism and Jim Crow segregation in the United States. However, all that changes for him when he joins the Army.
20 years old by the time the Second World War had become a reality?
No, I finished school in 1943, and I was 18. And that's when I became part of the military.
And how did you become part of the military? Did you volunteer? You were drafted?
Yes, I went out and I volunteered, and I was to go out with the next group. And when I went down to the induction center, institutional racism smacked me right in the face because the sergeant was there, and he told me to go one way when I went through the door, and he told my white friends to go another way because my country promoted institutional racism. And the military was one of the largest to do just that. And so I went into an all-Black unit, save for the officers. They were white. But all of my comrades in arms at that time were Black.
Induction marked the start of a brutal new kind of education for him, beginning with 2 hard and disaffecting rounds of basic training in the Jim Crow South. This was first in Georgia, later in Mississippi, followed by maneuvers in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And this extended training was actually typical for African American GIs, the majority of whom were trained in combat before they were reassigned and retrained in unarmed labor units. And Bass was assigned to the 183rd Combat Engineers. And this was a time when, as with civilian life, formal and informal color lines snaked across every aspect of military service. White soldiers, lynch mobs, vigilante groups, numerous iterations of state and local civic and law enforcement agencies, they all policed these lines as they saw fit. And at the same time, Jim Crow lawmakers at the state and federal levels vowed to defend the social and political order of Jim Crow at whatever cost. Even U.S. blood banks remained segregated at this time, which was a holdout of explicit racial science so egregious, so parallel to Nazi race law that it became one of the most heated civil rights issues of the war years. And in the case of the armed forces, the stress and strain and insult of these color lines became particularly intensified, right? Second-class citizenship is not tolerable to someone in uniform, someone who's risking his life for his country. And many African Americans at this time had observed distinct connections between Nazism and Jim Crow, had recognized the parallels on the basis of racism, white supremacy, militarism, empire, and attacks on organized labor. So the patriotic rhetoric of the war, right, fighting in defense of democracy, the framing of World War II as a war of good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny, to many African Americans this appeared hypocritical and rather fraudulent.
Was it your perception, though, that the black troops generally, though, fully understood the fact that while the rhetoric of the war against Nazi racism and so forth was fine, in practice, the country was doing something entirely different?
Yes. It was as though you were schizophrenic. Our country was two personalities, you know. One way we may make the wonderful pronouncements, you know. We talk about our Judeo-Christian ethics and we're going to make the world a better place for democracy and all that other jazz. But then when you cut down to the real thing and you start seeing the way they operate, no, things were not in consonance. And so I began to be an angry, frustrated young black soldier. At this time, I wanted to get out of the Army. I'll be very honest with you. After my experiences, I really did not want to be in this man's army. And especially after having to stand on a bus when there were no seats at the back, having to stand up for 100 miles looking at empty seats. That didn't endear me to my country. Couldn't eat in a restaurant. I had to go around the back and knock on the door to get food. And I'm in a uniform. And I saw PWs, prisoners of war from Germany, being allowed to go in a restaurant and sit down to eat, and yet I was not entitled for that same opportunity.
Bass's battalion shipped out for Europe in October 1944 and connected with the U.S. Third Army in Belgium, where they fought as part of the Battle of the Bulge, which was the last major German offensive campaign on the Western Front. And as laborers, soldiers like Bass were first on the front lines. They were building roads and bridges. They were loading equipment and supplies, disabling landmines, moving the wounded and the dead. And Bass's battalion crossed into Germany in March of 1945. And by April, they had reached the central German city of Weimar.
We went to Weimar and set up our bivouac area, and then went immediately with an officer, about 5 of us. We were in the intelligence reconnaissance section of our unit, and we went right to Buchenwald. And that was the day that I was to discover what had really been going on in Europe under the Nazis, because I walked through the gates and I saw walking dead people. Seriously, walking dead people. I am not a doctor. I cannot assess things that accurately, but in just looking at these people who were skin and bone and dressed in those pajama type uniforms, their heads clean shaved and filled with sores due to malnutrition. And here they were coming towards us, making all kinds of guttural statements and using their own language, and it was very difficult for me to comprehend what was going on. I just looked at this in amazement, and I said to myself, you know, my God, you know, who are these people? What have they done? What was their crime? You know, it's hard for me to try to understand why anybody could have been treated this way. I don't care what they had done. It just didn't grab me. And I didn't have any way of thinking, or putting a handle on it, no frame of reference. I was only 20.
When U.S. forces discovered Buchenwald, they found over 21,000 people imprisoned there. In the days before their arrival, the Germans had attempted to evacuate some 30,000 others, roughly a third of whom perished in the process. The earliest inmates at Buchenwald, which opened in 1937, were political prisoners, but the German SS and police had sent many Jews there, alongside Roma, Jehovah's Witnesses, military deserters, repeat criminals, and other groups. And at the end of the war, Buchenwald was one of roughly 44,000 camps, ghettos, and incarceration sites operated by Nazi Germany and its allies across Europe.
Terms like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and Majdanek and places like that were not known to you.
Even when I went into Buchenwald, I had no idea that those places existed. Those names only came to me after I got out of the service. Later, much yet later, I began to hear of names of places and realized that there was more than just a Buchenwald, that there were many, many, many Buchenwalds of different names all over Europe and in Russia. That's what boggles the mind, to think that a group in a society can organize and do it in a systematic way, such a program to remove from the world a whole group of people and any others that didn't think were worthy.
Like many of his comrades, Bass initially experienced a kind of numbness about what he had seen. Military intelligence had not prepared soldiers for the realities of the camps, and within weeks, Bass was shipped off to the Philippines to finish his service. And upon return to the United States, he set forth to build a life, all the while keeping silent about what he had seen. He started a family, pursued a PhD, built his career, and became involved with the civil rights movement. And years later, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968 shook him to the core. It had a profound impact on him. And in his testimony, he describes the heartache and horror he felt in its wake, particularly when he confronted the pain and disillusionment of many of the young Black and brown students at the high school where he served as a principal. And one day, these present realities in the United States and his memories of the war collided when a visitor came to one of his classrooms.
And one day I came to a classroom, and in that classroom there was a lady, and she was trying to talk to the young men who were not listening to her. You know, they were doing everything but listening. And I stood at the door and I began to realize that she was a survivor. And she had survived one of the worst camps. She had survived Auschwitz. And she was here today, on this particular day, to share her experience, her pain, if you will. And these young men were not listening. They had their own pain, you know. And I understood that, you know, the pain of rejection, the pain of not being given the kind of recognition you deserved. I understood all of that. I had been through there. And I knew their pain, but I also knew her pain. And so I had to say to them, hold it, fellas, cool it. Listen, what she says is true. I was there. And so they got quiet for a while. And once she started telling her account of what happened at Auschwitz, they really listened. And she told them how she lost her grandmother, grandfather, her parents, brothers, sisters, cousins, all those near and dear who had come into that camp. All of them had gone to the gas chambers and had ended up in the ovens. And of her family, she was the only one that came out of there. And they listened. She shared with them so much. And they asked her questions, which made me know that she had to reach them. And they came up and looked at the numbers tattooed on her arm, and they thanked her. And they did something hadn't been done in a long while. They left that room in silence. And of course she turned to me, and of course tears were coming down her face. And she thanked me for my intervention and wanted to know more about my experience at Buchenwald. And I began to remember.
Bass's experience was unique, but what he made of that experience and how he, in his words, began to hook things together in subsequent decades is instructive for us all. Bass's memories of military service and camp liberation, and how those memories came to bear on his interpretation of racism in the United States, it results in a call for unity. His testimony concludes with a call for an anti-racist coalition building force, but he also closes with a call for vigilance. The Holocaust forced a global moral reckoning. In the United States, it was a tipping point that compelled many white Americans to examine the state of their own country and to get behind African Americans' demands for fundamental civil and human rights. But the realities of the Holocaust also played a significant part in forcing white supremacists to abandon the most explicit and chauvinist articulations of their worldviews, right, lest they be associated with the unsightly backwardness of the recent war. And it's significant that Bass re-engaged with his memories of Buchenwald around 1970. Formal narratives and institutions of Holocaust memory were on the rise in the United States around that time. But as he so delicately puts it in his testimony, this was a moment when many of the promises of civil rights had begun to falter. And the government and many white Americans were clearly coming up short in the project of reflection and reckoning, the project of dismantling and rebuilding their racist foundations. And Bass saw that failure. He saw it in the refusal of his community to change, but most especially amongst his young students. Really, Bass's memories open up the possibility of productive comparison towards solidarity and racial justice. He asks us to consider not only what changed after 1945, but also what attitudes and cultures stayed the same. And in particular, stayed the same cloaked or carried on in innuendo or in action. And as an educator, Bass concludes his testimony with an important lesson for us all.
And look what it did to us. Racism has just about split us so many different ways till we can't live in harmony with one another. Suspicious. All of this I discovered as an adult. And I didn't get it when I was young, when I should have had it, because people didn't want to deal with it. It was an ugly side of our history, and ugly things we want to push under the rug. We don't want to deal with it. And I'm saying to people today, you must face it. You can't laundry and sanitize our history. You must take history with its beauty, and you must take it with its degradation. You've got to deal with it for us to be whole human beings and to make a difference. And this is especially true with young people. And so I go around telling my story, and of course I get the people saying, Leon, what are you dealing with this? This is not a black problem. Why? I said, hey, it's not a black problem, it's not a white problem, it's a human problem. And we've got to face it. And as Dr. King says, injustice anywhere is a loss of justice everywhere, you see. Words to that effect. And it's true. What affects you affects me. Your pain has to be my pain, and my pain has to be your pain. And I must somehow convey that to the young people that I come to. It's my commitment. And somebody says, why do you deal with that mess? I said, I'm sorry. I know it's been 40-some years, but that doesn't make it go away. It only makes us become more aware that we today have to do something to stop that which created the final solution. And that something is racism. Really, racism is at the root of all of this. Under that umbrella comes bigotry and prejudice and discrimination, unemployment, people who are unemployable, large institutions filled with those who are drug addicts and those who are criminals, all because somehow we have come to grips with that institution called racism. And we have to, because we see the ultimate of racism, which was what I saw at Buchenwald. And so what do? Do we as educators, and I use it in the broadest sense because we're all teachers of the young, in our way of life, do we convey to them the best that we can be, or do we give them the worst side that we have? Do we promote racism through our apathy? When we hear and see things, we say nothing because we don't want to jeopardize that which is important to us, our investment in a job, our investment among friends. We don't want to disturb our families. So no matter what people say or do, just leave it alone. Sweep it under the rug, and somehow it'll go away. But the skinheads are with us. The Klan is with us. It may be dressed in Brooks Brothers suit with attaché cases. They may be in doctors. They may be lawyers. They may be the guy who drives a bus. But they're still with us.